Yeah, let's about 2 minutes after, so let's go ahead and get started.
I'm going on mute.
Yep, everybody, please. Thank you, Betsy. On the left-hand corner, bottom of your screen, you should see a little icon. Please go ahead and click that to mute yourselves. And then when the talk is over, we will have time for comments and questions, or you can also type any comments or questions you have. In the screen at the bottom, there's like a little chat box, a Q&A box, and you can also put anything there that you'd like to. So I think I know most of you, but for those of you who may not know me, my name is Deb Schmidle. I am a Love Living at Home member, and I have an academic background in 16th and 17th century English history. So I've been doing a series of these talks on British monarchs, and last week I did one on royal coronations, and of course then yesterday we got a big update on what's happening with Prince Charles or King Charles's coronation, but can't go into that today. And I also do some teaching for Lifelong, another senior center in Tompkins County. But today we are here to talk about Richard III. And what I'm going to do is start sharing my screen. And I'm going to turn off my camera because, as I've noticed, these are recorded, as you can see, and they do end up on YouTube. So if you have to miss part of it or you miss one, you can always go and watch them. There's links from the Love Living at Home page to the YouTube channel. But what I noticed when I looked back at a couple that they recorded for me, my hands fly all over the place when I talk, and I found it distracting watching myself. So I figured you probably don't want to see my hands flying all over the place. So what I'm going to do is turn off my camera.
And Deb, there's a few people still unmuted.
Unmuted. Okay.
Have the ability to do that.
I don't think I do have the ability. I'm just looking. It looks like the people I'm looking at. Looks like everyone I see is muted. Yeah, everyone I see is muted right now. Yeah, I think we're good. Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay, there we go. You should be able to see that. If you can't see it, please unmute yourself and let me know you can't see it, but you should be able to see it at this point. So yeah, let's get started. I'm excited to finally do this. Sorry, I had to postpone it from March. So Richard III, some say the last Plantagenet king. Richard was vilified by Shakespeare, and he's been portrayed down the centuries by historians as being really abhorrent, both physically and morally. And he remains one of the most notorious monarchs in British history, despite the fact that he only ruled for 2 years. He was only on the throne for 2 years. But when you ask people who don't know a lot about British history, you know, name some famous British kings for me, Henry VIII always comes up. Sometimes Richard the Lionheart comes up, but Richard III often comes up, even though he was only on the throne for 2 years. And really, at the time of his birth, he was an unlikely candidate as a future king. However, by the age of 30, he had acceded to the throne in a manner that still causes controversy to this day. So we're going to look at his life and his legacy and the notoriety that followed him, whether that was fair or not, followed him pretty much from the time he was king all the way up to the present day. So a little bit of background on his early years. He was born on October 2nd, 1452. He was born at Fotheringay Castle in Northamptonshire. He was the 11th child and 4th surviving son of the man on the left here, Richard, Duke of York, and his wife on the right, Lady Cecily Neville. So that's why he was never really, no one ever thought he would be king. I mean, he was way down the pecking order in terms of kids. But as a great-grandson of Edward III, his father was of royal descent, and he did have a claim to the throne. So his father, the Duke of York, did have a claim to the throne. Not surprisingly, his father was a very powerful nobleman and a very prominent duke in England during his time. And likewise, Richard's mother, Cecily, came from the very politically prominent and active family, the Neville family. So he did have royal blood coursing through his veins, particularly on his father's side, but again, never expected to be much of anything in terms of any kind of prominence, given his pecking order in the family. Okay, so now at the time of Richard's birth, Henry VI was the King of England, and England was in the middle of the War of the Roses. This was a 30-year dynastic struggle between two branches of the Plantagenet family. So the Lancasters, who were represented by the red rose on the left, and the Yorks, represented by the white rose on the right. And then in the middle is the Tudor rose, when the two houses finally converged and came together. I don't have time to really go into the War of the Roses. That could be not only a 1 hour talk in and of itself, it could be a lot longer than a 1 hour talk. It's very convoluted and complicated. So I'm going to give you a 2-minute, very basic summary that leaves out all the details. You really don't need to worry about it. I just want to lay the groundwork for how Richard gets where he gets. So Henry VI, who you see here, he was the king, as I said. He was from the Lancaster side of the family, and he came to the thrones of both England and France before the age of 1. This happened because his father, Henry V, and his grandfather, Charles VI of France, both died within months of each other. And there was a treaty between France and England. Henry V had married the daughter of the King of France, and a peace treaty during the 100 Years' War was drafted to say that Henry V's son would become King of France when King Charles VI died. Of course, being so young when both his father and his grandfather died, he had advisors. Henry VI had advisors ruling for him. He was a baby. But by the time he was 15, he was considered old enough to rule on his own. Now, unfortunately, his interest in government was very sporadic. He picked the wrong advisors. He was unable to prevent the kind of power struggles that began to develop at court. He lost Normandy during the 100 Years' War because it was still ongoing after his father died, and his father was a great victor in France. Henry was the opposite. He lost Normandy. And so we started seeing this erosion of his authority and his power. And then to add to this, he had a series of mental breakdowns beginning in 1473. So what does this have to do with Richard? Well, during this time, during these mental breakdowns, when Henry VI couldn't rule, standing in for him as Lord Protector was his cousin, Richard's father, Duke of York. So he was standing in for him as the Lord Protector. He did this on 3 separate occasions. By now you had civil war raging between the York and the Lancaster factions. In 1460, Richard's father was killed in the Battle of Wakefield, along with his eldest brother, so Richard's eldest sibling, Edmund. And at that point, Richard and another older brother, George, they were sent into protective exile. They went to Burgundy to be in exile. Meanwhile, Richard's eldest surviving brother, Edward, he took up the fight. So he took up the fight, and he did defeat the Lancastrians in 1461. You can see him on the left here. He defeated the Lancastrians, and he crowned himself Edward IV. And then 3 years later, he secretly married this woman on the right, Elizabeth Woodville. She was a young widow. She was the daughter of Lancastrians, and remember, Richard's family were Yorkists, so she was kind of seen as the enemy. She was not of nobility. And so these factors, her being a Lancastrian, her not being from noble classes, the fact that she was very good at securing, she had a large family. She had 2 sons by her first marriage. She had siblings, and she was very good at securing high offices and noble titles at the court for her relatives. So this was seen as nepotism. She was seen as influencing her husband, Edward IV. This made her very unpopular, particularly among the ruling nobility in the House of York. Now, I mention this because these factors are going to be really important in our story later on. So Edward IV, he becomes king, and he makes Richard, this makes Richard, his brother, a royal prince. So he created Richard the Duke of Gloucester. He made him a Knight of the Garter. And we think when Richard was around 16 years old, he was declared of age. So he started taking possession of some estates that his brother conferred on him. And he started commencing a more public life than he had been living. But things weren't over yet. Henry VI was off the throne. Edward IV was on the throne. But then we had this period for another 10 years while the War of the Roses was still batting back and forth. And you had this ongoing battle between Henry VI, who would get better, you know, he would start to recover. So his supporters would be battling Edward. Both of them took turns. Edward went into exile at one point with Richard. Richard followed him. Other times, Henry was in exile. So it was kind of a back and forth game for about 10 years there. And during this time, Richard was very loyal to his brother. He supported his brother. He proved to be a very worthy combatant. He earned his brother's gratitude. And along with that, he was given a lot of property along the way. So we see as Richard comes into young adulthood, he is becoming increasingly wealthy and increasingly powerful in his own right. And then finally, Edward IV finally destroyed the Lancastrian forces kind of once and for all in May of 1471. At that time, Henry VI was captured and imprisoned in the Tower of London. Henry VI's only son was killed in battle. And shortly after Henry VI was imprisoned at the Tower of London, he died. So all obstacles were more or less out of the way. Edward is now firmly king without any real obstacles in his way. And during this period, when Edward was finally solidifying his sovereignty, Richard was regularly at the court. He took part in major ceremonies. He appeared in Parliament. He was on the Royal Council. He again went into battle for his brother in Scotland and in France. So he was, really working in defense of his brother, in the court of his brother. He also Richard made a very advantageous marriage. In 1472, he wed his cousin, Anne Neville, who you see here in the middle of this drawing. She was the widow of Henry VI's son. Remember, I said Henry VI's son was killed in battle, and she was his widow. She had been married to Henry VI's son. Now, so what you see here in this drawing is on the left, there's Prince Edward. He was Henry VI's son. He was the Prince of Wales, killed in battle. And on the right, you see Richard, the future Richard III. So here, this is Anne with her two husbands. I have to say she doesn't look too pleased in this drawing, but she's surrounded here by her two husbands. But anyway, Richard marries her, his cousin. And during the marriage negotiations, he insisted on getting his future wife's share of her parents' immense inheritance. Her family had a huge inheritance, and he said, no, I want my wife's share of this now. At the same time, his brother George, the one he had gone into exile with, his brother was married to Anne's older sister. So they were keeping it all in the family. And George was doing the same thing. George wanted a big chunk of this inheritance. So George and Richard were kind of battling back and forth over who was going to get what. But Richard was one of the greatest landowners in the country. He had a large amount of territory in the north of England. This brought him a lot of financial gain, but also a lot of responsibilities. And he was said to have been a very good administrator, very intelligent, and he handled his lands and his territories very, very well. And again, really was in service to his brother. But meanwhile, his brother, Edward IV, the king, he was suffering from an increasingly poor reputation because a lot of people saw his court as kind of dissolute and corrupt. He had many, many mistresses. He imposed financial burdens on his people. He levied taxes without consulting Parliament, very unpopular taxes. And his brother George, the one married to Anne Neville's sister, the one that Richard was fighting over with the land, George ended up being charged with treason, and he was executed in 1478. So all of this made Edward somewhat unpopular, along with the fact that, he was married to Elizabeth Woodville, which a lot of people weren't happy about to begin with. So, okay, we're going to jump ahead. 1483, things take a sudden turn. On April 9th of that year, Edward IV dies unexpectedly. At this point, up until now, Richard, although he'd been serving his brother, was kind of keen to distance himself from his brother's unfavorable reputation. And again, he didn't like Richard. There was no love lost between Richard and Elizabeth Woodville. So he had been kind of distancing himself, but suddenly Richard's up in the north with his territories. His brother down in the south dies. The king dies. And at the time of his death, at the time of Edward IV's death, Edward and Elizabeth had 2 sons and 5 daughters. So the succession looked like it was in pretty good shape, right? They had their heir and their spare, and they had these daughters who they could marry off. However, the young man you see here, Edward V, he was only 12 years old. He was Edward IV's son, his eldest son, He was only 12 years old, so he was considered too young to rule. So again, just like the infant Henry VI, he needed a protectorate. He needed a Lord Protector or somebody to rule in his place. Now, in his will, Edward IV had named Richard, his brother Richard, the future Richard III, as the protectorate for his son. But Elizabeth Woodville's son by her first marriage, one of her sons by her first marriage, and her brother, they were already close allies of Edward IV's. They were in the royal council. They really dominated the royal council. Again, this is one of the reasons she was not popular, because she found these kind of sinecures and positions for her family. So there was fear among the Yorkists, because remember, these guys were Lancastrians, the Woodvilles were Lancastrians. So there was fear among the Yorkists that the Lancastrian Woodvilles would take control of the throne through this young 12-year-old king. They had a very strong influence on his upbringing. He was actually living, at the time his father died, he was living in Wales, on the border of Wales, with his uncle and his half-brother, his mother's child by her first marriage. And they were overseeing his upbringing and his education. And there was a belief that they were very keen to overturn Richard's role as protectorate and instead set up a regency council that would make Edward V king immediately, and they would keep the power. The Woodvilles would keep the power. They would control everything. They were already raising this kid. They were already educating this kid. So they wanted Richard to stay in the north. They wanted to cut him off at the knees, basically, and make sure that they could control things. There was concern about that. Richard, on the other hand, also had in his mind what he wanted to do. So we have this timeline that kind of rapidly develops between the end of April, shortly after the death of his brother Edward, and we'll look at that. So starting April 9th, Edward IV falls ill unexpectedly and he dies. On April 30th, Edward V's Woodville advisors, in other words, his half-brother and his uncle, his mother's brother and his mother's son by her first marriage, they were escorting the young Edward V from where he was living on the borders with Wales to London to get ready for his coronation, to put him on the throne. And they were seized and imprisoned by Richard's supporters. Now, interestingly enough, only the night before, these two men, the advisors, the Woodville advisors, had met with Richard. And so they were under the assumption that they were all allies, but they were seized and they were imprisoned. The next day, Elizabeth Woodville, kind of seeing what was unfolding, she flees to the sanctuary of Westminster Abbey with most of the rest of her family, including she had that one younger son. So she took him and her daughters and some other relatives, and they went into sanctuary. Sanctuary back then was, you could not violate it. You had safe sanctuary in a church, and nobody could enter that church and threaten you at all. So that's where they went. Meanwhile, Richard has come down from the northern territories. He pledged allegiance to his nephew, Edward V, and he comes in and he said, okay, I was named in the will as the protectorate of my nephew. I will escort him to London for his coronation. But when he gets there, they decide they're going to postpone the coronation until late June. They said there's no reason to have this coronation immediately. It can wait until late June. 4 days later, Richard's officially made the protectorate of Edward. And basically that means Richard's now in charge of the government. Richard's now running the show because his nephew is too young to do so. The very next day, May 9th, Richard sends Edward to the Tower of London for his protection, supposedly to protect him. Now, there is a custom of monarchs spending a night or two before their coronation at the Tower of London. There were sumptuous apartments there. It wasn't just, everyone thinks of it as a prison, but it wasn't just a prison. It was also a royal residence, and there were sumptuous royal apartments. So there is a precedent for going to the Tower of London before your coronation. However, Edward's coronation had been put off until late June. So this was pretty early to be sending him to the Tower for that reason. And Richard said, well, we're sending him, for his own protection because things are volatile and everything. So he went to the Tower of London. Then we jump ahead to the 16th of June. At this point, the Archbishop of Canterbury, working with Richard, he goes into Westminster Abbey, and he convinces Elizabeth Woodville, may have been a really big mistake on her part, but he convinces her to release her younger son from her custody. And he said, you know, the reason we're doing this is the coronation is coming up. We're going to have the coronation in late June. So really, you know, Edward V, he should have his brother with him. You want his brother at the coronation. Let me take him over there. She said, okay. That younger son was put in the Tower of London along with Edward. And then the very next day, coronation is canceled. Coronation is just flat out canceled. Now, the reason for this was said to be because a minister came forward and said, it told Richard that his brother's wedding to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid because his brother was already engaged to someone else at the time, possibly even married to someone else at the time. That's kind of up in the air, a woman named Lady Eleanor Butler. But even if you hadn't been married, if you were engaged was enough. Engagement, you could not marry anyone else. So he said this makes his marriage to Elizabeth Woodville invalid, and therefore his children are illegitimate. They can't, Edward the Fifth can't be king. He's illegitimate. But there's absolutely no independent or even contemporary evidence at that time from the 1460s to support this claim that Edward IV had been engaged to somebody or married to somebody else. They've never been able to find anything about that. Nonetheless, Richard takes this to the Royal Council and says, I'm concerned about this. We need to cancel the coronation. These children are illegitimate. And very soon after that, a minister named Ralph Shaw, he preached at St. Paul's Cross. This was an area right in the precinct of St. Paul's Cathedral, very popular area for crowds to gather and hear these kind of preachers coming in and talking or royal pronouncements. And he was talking about, he was quoting from the Bible, and I can't remember which passage it was now, but something to do with illegitimacy. Because then there was even rumors flying around that Edward IV was illegitimate, which was frankly quite ridiculous. But anyway, so he preached about that. On the 25th of June, Parliament said, okay, the princes are illegitimate on the grounds that their father had been contracted to marry this other woman, even though we had no proof of that anywhere. The following day, Richard, as the next heir, is declared king. So he becomes king. Meanwhile, Richard is really busy getting all of his brother's former advisors out of the way. The two Woodvilles that they captured early on back in April, they were executed for treason. Some other people that surrounded Edward IV, his advisors, they were executed or taken away. So he was things were getting cleared out of the way. And then on July 6th, Richard III has his coronation. That leads us to these two boys in the Tower that are still in the Tower of London. And you can see this very romanticized, the Victorians just loved these tragic romances. So here's this very romanticized picture of the two boys clinging to each other in the Tower of London. The last recorded sighting of the boys that we know about was said to have been late summer or early autumn in 1483. And this is when the Great Chronicle of London tells us that they were seen playing and shooting in the gardens of the Tower. Witnesses saw them playing in the gardens. By this time, all of their regular servants had been dismissed. And we do know that definitely by mid-autumn, there was no sighting of them. They had disappeared. They were never seen in public again. And it became common belief throughout England and across Europe, where the news had spread by then, that the boys were dead, that they were dead. We don't know exactly what happened to them. We don't know when and how they died, if they died in the Tower. I assume they died in the Tower, but we don't know that for sure. And there's still ongoing debate as to who killed them, if they died in the Tower, or how they died. Many historians have blamed Richard for their deaths, and that's what makes him so notorious. That is why we still talk about him today. That's why people know who he is. But fingers have also been pointed at others who may have benefited from their demise, including the man who ultimately overthrew Richard, who we'll talk about later, Henry VII. Now, Henry VII's claim to the throne, as we'll see later, was very tenuous, and he spent most of his reign looking over his shoulder for possible usurpers. So good argument for why Henry may have wanted these boys out of the way, even though he got rid of their uncle. If these boys were still around, he would want them out of his way. Another theory is that Henry VII's mother, Margaret Beaufort, she was very ambitious. She was really a strong woman who helped ensure that her son became the first Tudor king, that he overthrew Richard III. There were theories that maybe she had a hand in this to try to clear the path for her son to become king. But none of these theories, whether we're talking about did Richard do it, did Henry VII do it, did Margaret Beaufort do it, did someone else do it, or did nothing happen at all? Did these boys just die naturally? None of these theories can be proved. We have nothing concrete in writing. Some theories say they even lived to adulthood. That seems highly unlikely, but some people posit that that might be the case. What we do know is in 1674, when there was some work going on at the Tower of London, the bones of children were found under a staircase in the White Tower, in the Tower of London. They were assumed to be the bones of these children, of these two boys. The remains were transferred to Westminster Abbey. The king at the time, Charles II, commissioned Christopher Wren to design this white marble sarcophagus that you see here. And the Latin inscription talks all about how the evil Richard III had his nephews smothered, and the good king, Charles II, is now bringing the rightful king, Edward V, and his brother back where they belong, to be interned in the Abbey. But there has never been any DNA work done on these bones, so we don't know anything about that. Supposedly, the late Queen Elizabeth II was approached more than one time to ask permission to be able to study the bones and do some DNA analysis, and supposedly she said no. So we still don't even know if these are the bones of the boys. We do know that there's some animal bones mixed up in there as well, but there are definitely children's bones in there. Now, there were a couple of imposters that surfaced during the reign of Henry VII, and one of them was this guy. He called himself, he was a Flemish man, calling himself Perkin Warbeck. He claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, who was the younger of the boys in the Tower of London. So he claimed that, yes, I survived, a sympathetic person got me out of there. He was wandering around Europe. He actually gained support, temporary support from the Holy Roman Emperor, from James IV of Scotland, from Charles VIII of France. Not so much because they believed that he was really Richard, Duke of York, but because they wanted to create instability in England, in Henry VII's court and in his country. So they had their own reasons for propping this guy up. And for a while they did. Some of them armed him. He tried multiple times to invade England, not successfully. Interestingly enough, he did gain recognition from Margaret of York, who was the sister of Richard III. She seemed to believe that this was indeed who he said he was, that he was the Duke of York. But eventually Perkin Warbeck kept invading England unsuccessfully. He was finally caught, imprisoned, and eventually executed. But that was one theory, that yes, he was really, one of the boys that survived. So some unanswered questions. Historians have been asking, these questions for a long time. If the boys were killed by Richard, why kill them if they'd already been declared illegitimate? They've already been declared illegitimate, so they couldn't be king anyway, right? Well, look, they were always going to be a focus for conspiracies. They were always going to be a focus for usurpation. They were sure to become more dangerous the older they grew, and the more they grew up. And just like earlier deposed monarchs, they had to be eliminated. It sounds horrible because they were just kids, but they had to be eliminated. That's how things were done back then. And there were people that they did have supporters. And in fact, in late July 1483, there was actually a failed attempt to free them from the Tower of London. So even though they were declared illegitimate, there was a reason for killing them. If they were alive, why not prove it? Why didn't Richard in October of 1483, all these rumors were swirling around that he had ordered them to be killed. So, and that was fueling, small little rebellions and people getting upset. So if they were alive, why didn't he parade them out and say, okay, see, they're alive? Well, again, good reason for that, because if they're alive, the loyalty would remain. People would still try to overthrow him, possibly, and get them out of the tower. If they were dead, why not prove that? Why not say, hey, they died of natural causes? You know, here are their bodies. You can see they died of natural causes. Get rid of your conspiracy theories. Get rid of the plan to overthrow me. They're gone. There is nobody else. I'm the king. So that's another question. And then if Henry Tudor himself had the boys killed, this happened, they disappeared 2 years before the Battle of Bosworth, which we'll talk about later, which overthrew Richard. Why do it so early? Did he know that far in advance? He probably did. I mean, he was garnering support at that time. So did he have someone in England do the dirty work for him and say, okay, let's get these guys out of the way now? But still, it was 2 years before he was invading England, which seems a little bit premature. There was an argument, and there's still an argument that, you know, Richard was fundamentally a good and religious man. He never would have killed his nephews. In my opinion, that's a flawed argument. Listen, we're talking the Middle Ages here. Kings did what they had to do to survive. You did not, it was a very brutal time. You did not survive by being a nice guy. Nice guys did not make, at that time, successful kings. So I think that argument is kind of a flawed one. And it's also obvious from the timeline that we looked at earlier, Richard moved extremely quickly to place himself on the throne. He didn't come down from York and, you know, swear his loyalty to Edward V. And then when this minister came to him and said, hey, I think your brother's marriage was illegitimate, he didn't stick up for his brother or his nephews. He didn't say, well, no, that's not true. My brother's marriage wasn't illegitimate. My nephew that I swore loyalty to is the rightful king. He immediately went boom, 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 boom. He got the Woodvilles out of the way and he immediately went forward to becoming king. So yeah, there's that. My questions, personal questions, are more about Richard's motivation. So was he motivated by personal ambition? If nothing else, whether or not he killed the boys in terms of this timeline and how quickly he acted, was this personal ambition? Was he acting in self-defense? I think he could have been. I mean, he had a probably not unfounded fear that the Woodvilles would imprison or kill him as a rival claimant. That was very likely to happen. We were still in, you know, the kind of turmoil, the after effects of the War of the Roses. So Richard may have been personally ambitious. I don't doubt he was, but he also may have been acting under self-preservation, that he had to, you know, make sure that he was saving himself. Or another argument was, as a Yorkist, did he honestly see this as his duty to ensure that the crown wouldn't fall back into Lancastrian hands? Was he in effect protecting the York lineage? We don't know. We do know that there have been 3 sources that have long fueled the case against Richard. Actually, more than 3, but the 3 I'm going to talk about, main ones, really fueled the case against Richard. And these came from men writing during the reigns of Henry VII, who overthrew Richard, Henry VII's son, Henry VIII, and Henry VII's granddaughter, Elizabeth I. So there was certainly a suspicion of political pandering here, if you will. These men were writing at times when they were trying to keep their sovereigns happy and kind of win the favor of their sovereigns. So the first one is this guy, John Rouse. He was a historian and a priest. And in around 1480, he started working on a history of the kings of England. And this was a general history. He was going to give it to Edward IV, actually, but then Edward died. John Rouse did not finish his work until 1486. So by this time, Edward IV is dead. Edward V disappears in the Tower of London. Richard III reigns for 2 years and he's killed. So he didn't finish this work until until Henry VII was on the throne. The guy that defeated Richard was on the throne. So of course, John Rouse wants to please his king, Henry VII. Now, interestingly enough, Rouse had written earlier another work he had written when Richard III was still alive. And in that work, he was very complimentary of Richard, very gushingly complimentary of what a great man Richard was. However, by the time he finishes his general history, you know, he was trying to pander to his king, and Henry VII had a real vested interest in portraying Richard as a bad king, because again, he had a very shaky legitimacy to the throne, and this would kind of strengthen his own legitimacy, right? So he was trying to do that. So what John Rouse wrote, which kind of launched this whole thing, particularly about Richard III's physical appearance and his physical impairments, he said, Richard was born at Fotheringay in Northamptonshire retained within his mother's womb for 2 years, and emerging with teeth and hair to his shoulders. At his nativity, Scorpio was in the ascent, which is the sign of the house of Mars. And like a scorpion, he combined a smooth front with a stinging tail. So in other words, he was very, very smarmy. He knew how to do things. He could smile at you and stab you in the back at the same time. I think the very fact that John Rouse is saying that the future Richard III was in his mother's womb for 2 years would probably be enough to discount anything else John Rouse had to say about Richard III. But nonetheless, his writings influenced this man, Sir Thomas More. Thomas More was at one time Henry VIII's Lord Chancellor until he fell out of favor with Henry and was executed. And Sir Thomas More really did maintain this image of Richard's wickedness. And he said, yeah, it was foreshadowed by his unnatural birth and his disfigured appearance. He was writing a history of Richard III, which he never finished. And he was writing this 30 years after Richard died. Sir Thomas More was not really a contemporary of Richard III's, but he wrote about him and he said, he is little of stature, he is ill-featured of limbs, he is crooked back, his left shoulder is much higher than his right. He has a hard visage, a hard-favored visage, meaning his face was hard. He was malicious, wrathful, envious. And he also describes Richard's difficult birth. Again, he's saying he was monstrous, he was unnatural. He was picking up on all this stuff that John Rouse said. In fact, John Rouse went so far as to compare Richard to the Antichrist. I mean, John Rouse was really going overboard. And then he also wrote, Thomas More also wrote, the innocent children lying in their beds, Miles Forrest and John Dighton, these were servants, about midnight came into the chamber and suddenly lapped them up among the clothes, so bewrapped them and entangled them, keeping down by force the feather bed and pillows hard unto their mouths, that within a little while, smothered and stifled, they gave up to God their innocent souls. Thomas More also then went on to allege that in 1502, a former official under Richard III, a guy named Richard Tyrrell, he confessed to murdering the princes shortly before he was put to death. Tyrrell was put to death by Henry VII for being a traitor, not having anything to do with the murder of these princes. And supposedly on the night before his execution, Tyrrell suddenly had this, I don't know, his conscience bothered him. And he said, oh, by the way, I killed the boys in the tower. There's no proof of that. There's no proof of that. There's nothing in writing. There's nothing documented that said he did that. But Thomas More asserted this. Thomas More was just a child at the time of the prince's disappearance. So again, not really a contemporary, an adult contemporary of what was going on during this time. And even Thomas More went on to say, some remain yet in doubt whether they were in Richard's day destroyed or no. So even Thomas More is saying, I think he's an evil, horrible man, and I think he did this, but there are some people who are still questioning whether Richard was responsible for the boy's death. That leads us to Shakespeare, who to this day is the person who his image of Richard III is who we still associate with Richard III. So Thomas More's description of Richard really provided the inspiration for William Shakespeare's play, Richard III, and for his earlier works. He had a couple of earlier works. He had a trio of plays, a trilogy, the Henry VI plays. Richard shows up in those plays as well. And Shakespeare portrays him as, he was responsible he killed Henry VI in the Tower of London, because Henry VI died somewhat suspiciously after he was imprisoned in the Tower of London. Well, it was Richard III that killed him. And he ordered the execution of his brother, George, Duke of Clarence, not, the king, Edward IV, didn't have his brother killed. No, it was Richard that had his brother killed. And of course, he killed the two brothers in the tower. He had to have. Now, in the Elizabethan period, disability was viewed as a sign of moral impairment. And Shakespeare really, really played off of that theme. He really leaned into it. And if you've seen a production of Richard III or read it, and I've seen many productions in the US and Canada and the UK, they always ask the audience to pay attention to Richard's body. And even if the actor playing Richard is not showing a deformity, you expect this from the language. And you can see the language right on here. This is Richard talking in one of the Henry VI plays. And he's saying, you know, love forswore me in my mother's womb. She did corrupt frail nature with some bribe, to shrink mine arm up like a withered shrub, to make an envious mountain on my back where sits deformity to mock my body, to shape my legs of unequal size, to disproportion me in every part. So Shakespeare's really responsible for pushing forward this kind of theory. And you can see this is from a production, a Royal Shakespeare production in the 80s. And this man is being shown as horribly deformed. He even has crutches, you know, and a very exaggerated hump on his back. He's leaning way over. So this image still carried on. And then it carries on in popular culture going forward. The top left-hand corner is Richard III from 1955. This was directed by and starring Laurence Olivier. It is among the most famous and celebrated film adaptations of Shakespeare's work. Can't really see it from this picture, but again, you know, Richard was the evil king and he did have a hunchback. The one right underneath it, I think this is a really interesting adaptation. This is from 1995. This one is with Ian McKellen playing Richard, but it's set in 1930s Britain, where Richard is portrayed as a fascist leader seeking to steal the throne. So you could argue it's maybe one of the darkest portrayals of Richard because it's likening him to Nazi leaders in Germany. And then on the right, one of the more recent ones, this is from a television series, a BBC production called The Hollow Crown. You may have seen it. It was on PBS. And it starred Benedict Cumberbatch as Richard III. Interestingly enough, Benedict Cumberbatch is said to be a second cousin 16 times removed of Richard. This was interesting because we're going to talk a little later about when they dug up Richard's bones and found Richard. Richard never had a hunchback. We're going to find that out later. He was not a hunchback. But even though this TV adaptation, The Hollow Crown, was made after Richard's bones were found, they still very much played off this image of Richard being heavily deformed in the TV series. So that was interesting. And most film and TV portrayals of Richard have been negative ones. Most of them, not all, but most of them, and almost all of the negative ones follow Shakespeare's dramatic presentation. Shakespeare was a dramatist. He wasn't a historian, you know, and people kind of forget that. Okay, so who was Richard as a king? Well, as I said, he had a short reign. He was only on the throne a little over 2 years. During that time, he suffered personal losses. His wife died, his only child, a son, died. He presented himself as a reformer, committed to justice and morality. He wanted to be seen as the person who was going to remedy the misrule of his brother's last years on the throne. He did end up making a sort of peace with Elizabeth Woodville. She and her family came out of sanctuary, and he provided for them. He did provide them and give them protection. He was a good governor. We know that from even before he was king. He was very good at governance and administration with his northern lands, and did so as well with the kingdom pretty much overall. He was very committed to justice and morality, particularly justice. He had a very impressive list of legislative achievements. He set up a court of requests for poor men to seek justice. The printing of laws in English happened for the first time. He temporarily banned arbitrary taxes that were levied by his brother. Unfortunately, he had to reverse that decision later, but he temporarily got rid of those. And he even created this kind of notion of bail to protect suspects from pretrial custody. So he did some really good things. He had some, and he was said to be very generous. He was pious. He had an interest in chivalry. So he did some very good things. But effective kingship required not only those qualities, but also a strong ego, self-interest, and you did have to be ruthless. Again, it was the Middle Ages. Everybody was gunning for your back. Like I said before, nice people did not make good kings. And over time, unfortunately, as we'll see in a minute, Richard started falling out of favor with the country. And he still had this shadow hanging over him of what happened to those boys in the tower. Nobody could say what happened to them. He couldn't present them alive or dead. And that was still hanging over his head, and the suspicion was largely, fingers were pointing at him. So the tide starts to turn. He was seen as a usurper by many, seen as someone who took the throne by force, not by consent. And that was not popular. He also had to revive these unpopular taxes that his brother had started, because he was constantly holding off this threat of invasion from France and from the future Henry VII. So that cost money. People weren't happy with that. I think one of the main issues that Richard had, aside from this, what happened to the boys, was he really mismanaged local affairs. He undermined and kind of destabilized local power structures. He was too much of a micromanager. So what happened was usually the king couldn't oversee every single inch of his land. So you'd have these barons, just as Richard did under his brother, Edward IV, you'd have these wealthy barons or maybe princes or whatever, overseeing parts of the kingdom for the king on behalf of the king. Richard undermined all of that. He was too much of a micromanager. He took power away from some of these barons in the north. He took power away from people in the south and actually brought some of the people from the north down to the south, really unpopular. And he set up an act of attainder in January of 1484. And what this was, is this is a way for the king to put his opponents outside the law and to take their estates. And he did this. He set up this act of attainder over 100 nobles, minor landowners, officers of the crown, even some from his own royal household. They had their property confiscated. A few were executed, not that many. Many chose to flee to Brittany. That's where Henry Tudor was in exile, the future Henry VII. So they fled over there to support him. There was a guy named the Duke of Buckingham. He was a big supporter of Richard's initially during the lead up to Richard becoming king. He lost all his lands and offices. And what started to happen was Richard started getting a little paranoid. He for better or worse, maybe he had a good reason, we don't know, but he started really mistrusting people, and he started surrounding himself with a smaller and smaller and smaller little group of people who he trusted. And so he was grabbing land and money and positions from people he didn't trust and giving them to this small nucleus that he did trust. Also, there was the problem that he no longer had an heir. He no longer had a wife. There was rumors that he wanted to marry his niece, his brother's daughter. We don't have any real truth to verify that. Again, that came out of Shakespeare. We do know he was looking to make another marriage, unsuccessfully as it happens, elsewhere in Europe. But there really isn't evidence that he planned to marry his niece. But rumors were flying around about that. So people are like, oh, how disgusting. I mean, it's one thing for cousins to marry each other, but you can't marry your young niece. That's not all. So things were bubbling up. And again, where were these princes? This set the stage for this guy, Henry Tudor, over in France, in modern day France. There was a rebellion in the south in 1483. Richard managed to suppress that, but again, many of these rebels ran off to Brittany, and they started recognizing Henry Tudor as their king. Now, I said that he had a claim, but a shaky claim. His father was the illegitimate half-brother of Henry VI. His mother also had royal blood, but again, through an illegitimate line. So Henry Tudor had a lot of high-octane royal blood, but it was coming from the wrong side of the blanket, if you will. So that made his bloodline, his claim somewhat dubious. But nonetheless, he was gathering a lot of support. You had these rebels coming over, including Yorkists. I mean, Yorkists, who should have been on Richard's side, leaving England, coming to France, and Henry was working with them. He also recruited a lot of professional French and Scottish mercenaries, and that led to an invasion in 1485 of England. And that led to Richard's downfall. So you can see on the left here, this is where the Battle of Bosworth was fought. Henry came over. Richard was very confident he could beat Henry. Henry had a very small army. He only had about 5,000 men. Richard had at least 15,000 men, about 3 times the size of Henry's. And he also had a third force of 6,000 men, led by a one-time Lancastrian who had recently become a Yorkist, a guy named Thomas Stanley. So originally, to begin with, Richard's troops had the upper hand initially, but his luck faded. And when the advantage started turning to Henry, Richard's troops started deserting him. So he had like this rear guard of 7,000 men who were supposed to take on Henry's troops. This guy that led the troops was Henry Percy. He was the Lord of Northumberland, but he never gave the order for these 7,000 men to engage with Henry VII, the future Henry VII's troops. So no fighting took place. And in effect, Richard lost that whole rear flank of his battlefield, and that was devastating for him. And then I mentioned Thomas Stanley, who had these 6,000 men. The guy used to be a Lancastrian, then became a Yorkist. Well, he had his brother with him, William. So William and Thomas Stanley were there on the battlefield. They had been loyal to Richard. They had been loyal, but ultimately they turned against him because they saw, number one, which way the wind was blowing. On top of that, Thomas, who had these 6,000 men, believe it or not, he was married to Henry Tudor's mother. So he was Henry Tudor's stepfather. So he sat back and did nothing. So people started deserting Richard. And you can see on the right here again, this is Benedict Cumberbatch looking very dramatic in the Battle of Bosworth. Now, everyone accounts to how strong and brave Richard was in battle. Even John Rouse, who compared him to the Antichrist, said, you know, if I may say in truth to his credit, though small in body and feeble of limb, he bore himself like a gallant knight, and he acted with distinction as his own champion until his last breath. But his last breath did happen on the 22nd of August, 1485, when he was killed in a rather gruesome way, killed in battle. His helmet was ripped from his head, and he was brutally killed. After the battle, his corpse was thrown over a horse, supposedly naked. He was naked, and he was returned to Leicester, where the battle started from, accompanied by Henry Tudor, the victorious Henry Tudor, and his Lancastrian army. And he was buried in, the abbey no longer exists. It was a friary, Grey Friars, it no longer exists, but it was, this is a digital representation of what it would look like. This is where he was buried with no ceremony. His naked body was put on display for the public to see for 3 days before he was buried. This sounds awful, but in the absence of live news broadcasting during that day, displaying Richard's body really allowed word to spread that he was truly dead. People could see it with their own eyes. And what that did was prevent the appearance of potential imposters, like we saw with Perkin Warbeck, like we saw when we didn't see the boys' bodies shown. So that would, Henry Tudor was trying to cut off any dissent that might come forward by saying, here he is, he's dead, you can see him. So he was buried again without ceremony in this friary. The friary was destroyed under Henry Tudor's son, Henry VIII, during the dissolution of the monasteries. But in January 2011, the University of Leicester, their archaeological services department, they were approached by a woman named Philippa Langley. Philippa Langley is a screenwriter and a member of the Richard III Society. Richard III Society has been around for a very, 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 very long time. They are very loyal to Richard and his memory. It's amateur historians, basically, but they are very dedicated to defending Richard's memory. So they came forward and they said, look, we want to find the burial place of Richard III. We know he was buried in this friary. We know it's no longer here, but it was in Leicester. And at first, Leicester's like, nah, well, what the heck? We don't think we're going to find him, but at the very least, we might find some information on the friary. So like, okay, yeah, let's do this. They funded, the university funded about 80% of the dig. The project didn't involve just people from the university and the Richard III Society. Experts from all over the world came and were involved. And sure enough, not only did they find the friary, they found the skeletal remains of what they believed could have been Richard III, based on what they saw. So you can see some excavating going on here. He was underneath a parking garage. That's where they found him. And here is his body. So basically what they found was, or his skeleton, they found a skeleton of a male that had curvature of the spine and evidence of battle wounds. And his skeleton, amazingly, was almost totally intact. There was just a little bit missing. Almost everything was intact. So in the following months, the skeleton was subject to scientific analysis. They did radiocarbon dating. They did a detailed examination of the bones to see how he died. And then they did an analysis of the DNA. And on the 4th of February, 2013, the university announced with absolute certainty that these were the remains of Richard III. And you can see from this photograph that the grave was very hastily dug. It was too short for the body. You can't really see well from this angle, but he's kind of propped up. The head and neck and back are kind of propped up. He's kind of awkwardly propped up. No evidence of a coffin, no evidence of a shroud, just kind of dumped in there, laid in there with his head and torso kind of crammed up against the edge. Today, you can, if you go to Leicester, there's a Richard III Visitor Center, and they've glassed over where the grave site was, and you can look down and see can't see the skeleton, obviously, but you can look down and see where the grave was. Now, Richard did have a very pronounced curvature of the spine. This is his skeleton again, very visible that you can see here. So evidence of scoliosis. You could see this in the individual vertebrae. And he was described, contemporaries described him as having unequal shoulders, and that's consistent with the type of scoliosis that he seemed to have. They don't think this was, they think that this was a scoliosis that developed in him as a child. Now, it looks like a really large curvature, but the actual physical disfigurement, from what anyone could see with a naked eye when he was dressed, was probably very slight. Yes, his right shoulder was probably higher than his left. I have scoliosis. My right shoulder is slightly higher than my left, but you really have to look for it. If I didn't tell you, you wouldn't see it. He did not, there was no evidence that he walked with a noticeable limp, which Shakespeare had talked about. His legs seemed symmetrical, the leg bones were symmetrical, they were well formed. His neck was fine, so he could carry his head and neck straight. So scoliosis wouldn't have been really obvious to people, particularly if he had a good tailor. Nobody would really be able to tell. There was no evidence of a withered arm. That was another thing that Shakespeare said. No, yes, he had one shoulder slightly higher than the other. No withered arm. You can see from the skeletal remains, perfectly symmetrical. But that was actually, I thought it was fascinating to kind of see what this skeleton looks like with the scoliosis. Now, we don't really have any contemporary portraits identified as Richard. They're all about 25 or 30 years after his death. But the DNA analysis they did said that he probably had a high probability of blue eyes, and as a child probably had blonde hair that then darkened with age. So on the left is the portrait we most associate with Richard. On the right is a bust that was made by the Richard III Society, commissioned by the Richard III Society, based on the skeletal remains of Richard as what they thought he looked like. So what we really think now, what historians think now, is probably, based on all those findings, the most accurate portrait of Richard was probably this one. This is called the arch-topped portrait, and it's in the Society of Antiquaries in London. And they think that this is probably the closest to what he probably looked like. So the final burial site, or the fight for Richard, as I call it, Richard always courted controversy, even after death. So this launched a fight between two cities. Where do we reinter Richard? Where do we bury Richard? Give him his final burial site. Well, he held all these northern territories. He lived in York for a long time. He was a Yorkist. So York argued that they should have Richard. This is what he would have wanted. Kirsten England, who was the chief executive of the city of York at the time, he said Richard III had, as now, very strong support in the city. His self-identification with the North and York is reflected in his plans for York Minster, and he wanted to be buried in York Minster. This is where he should be buried. And one local council leader in the North went as far as to say, how can we trust Leicester to look after Richard? To be perfectly blunt, the people of Leicester misplaced him for more than 500 years. Would we really wish to entrust his remains to them again? I think not. You had more than 11,000 people signing a petition saying, no, he's got to be interred in York instead of Leicester. But in the end, where he died, Leicester, and where he was found, Leicester, or near Leicester he died, but he was, his body was found in Leicester. Leicester won out. And they won out actually in part because York Minster on the right here, they said, we don't want him actually. The chapter of York said, we understand the strong feelings of some people in York and Yorkshire that Richard III is significant to the history of the country, and therefore his body ought to be returned. However, the recent verification of the identity of his remains follows a significant period in which Leicester and Leicestershire gained a sense of Richard belonging there, at least in death. We commend Richard to Leicester's care. This was great for Leicester, gave them all kinds of tourism boost. York did not need a tourism boost. York is already a tourist town. And York's like, yeah, we really don't want him. So sure enough, he is interred in Leicester Cathedral. And this is a screenshot. I'm sorry, it's not a really good shot. A screenshot off the TV from the BBC coverage, because it was covered. He had a procession. His remains had a procession through the streets of Leicester. You can't really tell from this picture, but more than 35,000 people turned out to watch his cortege pass. Just the way people turned out to watch the cortege of Elizabeth II when she died. His casket was on display in Leicester Cathedral for 3 days prior to his interment, so people could come through and visit. More than 20,000 people came through to look at his casket. Again, much in the same way that we witnessed last September with Elizabeth II. People came through to see this. And then on the day of the burial, people gathered in Leicester city center. Some came several hours before the service. Some camped out overnight. And there were large TV screens set up so they could see, because it was all televised, so they could see the interment ceremony. The Archbishop of Canterbury, the head of the Church of England, he presided over the service along with some local senior clergy. The service was attended by about 200 members of the public, representatives of many of those involved in finding and identifying Richard's remains. And the royal family was represented by the Countess of Wessex and the Duke and Duchess of Gloucester, and the Queen herself, the late Queen herself, wrote a foreword to the order of service. And she said, "Today we recognize a king who lived through turbulent times and whose Christian faith sustained him in life and death." And Benedict Cumberbatch, who played Richard, as we saw in The Hollow Crown, he actually read a poem by the poet laureate about Richard, and you can see his remains there being placed in the tomb. During the service, the Right Reverend Tim Stevens, who was the Bishop of Leicester, he said, "People have come in their thousands from around the world to this place of honor, not to judge or condemn, but to stand humble and reverent. From car park to cathedral, today we come to give this king and these mortal remains the dignity and honor denied to them in death." And York also had their own service. They had a service at the Minster. They had a choral evensong, and they had their own procession through the city as well. So, as I said, controversy with Richard remains to this day. On the left here, there's a statue in Leicester of Richard III. And many of the people who were standing in those crowds to see his cortege pass were holding on to white roses, because remember, the white rose was the symbol of the York side of the Plantagenet family. And so they left white roses, and in some cases carnations and other white flowers, at the foot of Richard's statue in Leicester. But at the same time, someone left a note that read, "In memory of Henry VII, a great king for 24 years, his victory over the usurper and child killer at Bosworth Field was superb." So Richard's legacy still follows him to this day, for better or worse. Again, we don't have any hard evidence. There's all kinds of theories that float around. Was he guilty? Was he not guilty? The jury is still out until somebody digs up, like they dug up Richard, until somebody digs up some writing someplace, some real confession someplace, some proof someplace. It remains a great mystery. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And I'm going to turn my camera back on, and you can all unmute yourselves. And please, any questions or comments? Yep, you're muted. That's
What do you-
oh, there you go.
Do you want to comment? I won't do it. I'll let you do it because you know more about it than I do. On the movie at Cinemapolis, The Lost King.
Yeah. So there's a movie at Cinemapolis right now called The Last King, and it's fictional, but it's based on a book written by Philippa Langley, the woman I was speaking of from the Richard III Society, who helped launch this, or actually did launch it. They should get credit for that. She is the one that pushed to have this dig undertaken, this excavation undertaken. The movie itself is courting controversy and has courted controversy. It's been out in England for a while. It just got out and came out in the States. It is courting controversy because it is asserting basically, and again, this is what drama does, just like Shakespeare. Like I said, Shakespeare's not a historian. Everybody takes this as historical fact. Shakespeare is not a historian. So of course Shakespeare was going to write in a dramatic fashion. He's trying to sell his plays. He wants people to show up to his plays. So this film, which is not a documentary, it's a fictionalized account, puts Philippa Langley at real odds with the University of Leicester, her work is undermined. She doesn't get credit for what she did. These men, particularly one man in particular, who I think was the chancellor maybe of the university, he bullies her and he's very misogynistic toward her. There has been, and they said that, really it was the Richard III Society that did this. They did crowdsourcing to get the money to do this. It's true they did raise some money through crowdsourcing, but the University of Leicester took great exception to this when it came out. Particularly this man whose reputation was really getting besmirched as being someone who really mistreated her. Now, it's true, we know that misogyny exists in higher education and elsewhere, but there is not evidence of that. There were women on the dig. Philippa Langley herself spoke glowingly about this man previously, before she wrote her book and before the film came out, and thanked him for his role in all of this. The university got very defensive, particularly on his behalf, of course, because his reputation was getting sullied, even though this was, the film was a fictionalized account, the book supposedly wasn't. So that's courted a lot of controversies, to the point that the University of Leicester, if you go to their website, they actually have a whole page about this, and they released their financial records to say, we paid for 80% of this. And what's more, they're also countering, it's ironic that the film is making this claim of misogyny and Philippa Langley being pushed out of the way and not being recognized for her work, while there were at least 3 lead archaeologists on this project, and one person working on the DNA, who were female. They never showed up in the film. It was all these men. So yeah, that is causing some controversy. I haven't seen the film. I haven't seen it yet. I have not read the book, but again,
And he's considering a lawsuit, I think.
yeah, I think he is. And honestly, there's a lot of evidence, correspondence between them, other witness. I don't blame the man. I can't blame the man. I agree. I'm all for defending women. And certainly there's been a lot of stuff that women have been, their work has been stolen, but in this particular case, yeah, it is defamatory. The counter argument is, at least for the film, it's fictional. No one said it was a documentary. But he's named, it's his name, it's his, so what do you, yeah, it's
So Richard continues his controversial role in history. I'm waiting for it to come to Netflix or Amazon. I'm hoping.
I'm sure it'll come to Amazon Prime. Yeah. No, Richard does continue to court controversy in one way.
So another question for you briefly. Did Elizabeth II ever say why she didn't want a DNA study on the bones found in the tower?
No, the only thing we ever heard, and again, it wasn't even totally official, was just that she turned down requests for it. So we never heard why she turned. And now that we have
King Chuck might.
Charles might, if they come forward again, Charles may. My guess is it probably is the boys. There weren't a lot of children in the tower, and why would they be? If they died, why would they be buried under stairs if they were living?
Right.
So my guess is, yeah, it probably is them. And maybe, I don't know why apparently she did not want to engage in that for whatever reason. So
the other thing you might want to talk about, Deb.
Yes, Josephine Tay, the daughter of time. This was a book written in the 50s. And as I said, this was actually my introduction to Richard III.
It was mine too.
It's a book about a policeman who is in the hospital. He's injured, I think his back or something. And he can't move. He's laying in bed and getting grumpier and grumpier because he can't do his job. And someone starts bringing him these these drawings, these artworks, and he's studying faces. He likes to study faces. So he sees this picture of Richard III. He said, this does not look like an evil man to me. And then he gets very obsessed with investigating this whole thing about Richard III and did he kill the princes in the tower? And Josephine Tay, and this is how he takes up his time in the hospital, and he gets people to bring him books and things. It was a fascinating book. It's really well written. It's really interesting. Josephine Tay obviously did a lot of in-depth research. She knew her stuff. She did skew the facts a little bit for them toward Richard, I have to say. There were a couple things but she definitely, did some very valid research on this. And and so for me, it was really interesting because someone brought me this book when I was in the hospital for 8 days. So I laid there kind of not doing quite what the person in the novel did, but I was sitting there reading and going, oh, interesting. Oh, you
Yeah.
know, and that kind
Bringing
of,
a modern day police
Yeah.
detective's sensibilities to
Yeah.
figuring out whether Richard III really did some of the things he was accused of. It's
exactly.
really a great book.
Using his own detective work to, for me, it was certainly a very entertaining and read while I was laid up as well. So yeah. So that's just been reissued, that book. It's just been
Yeah.
reprinted again.
This
So,
is thanks to you, Deb, the new version.
yes, new version. Yeah.
New edition, anyway.
Other questions or comments?
I have a comment. I saw the movie, and one thing about the movie, I agree with your comments. It's controversial, as I read about it afterwards, because they badmouthed the universities so much, and I think that was really not called for. They should have changed names, whatever. But Philippa Langley is portrayed as a woman that really may not be completely in touch with reality. Also,
Well, I didn't see the film, but I saw clips, and I know there was an element of. Yeah, I mean, it was this element because didn't she like envision him or something, or she's talking to him and she's.
Yeah, she said
Yes.
she had this feeling when she was in the car park or something.
yes,
Yeah.
Yeah.
And there's a little bit of whether Philippa Langley knew this or not, and she may not have, so I don't want to cast aspersions on her either. I don't know her. But she said, I got this sensation that he's in the car park. I've got the sensation he's in the car park. We've got to dig there. Well, in 1986, I think, there was an historian or archaeologist, I forget what this guy's background was, who wrote a whole long paper on why he thought Richard was right around that car park, because that's where they thought that the Greyfriars was. But no dig was done at that time. So whether she read that paper and then later got a feeling, it would have been, or if she came across that paper and later got the feeling, I don't know. Again, I don't want to, I don't know. But someone had already posited that perhaps Richard is under the car park because they thought that that's where the Greyfriars friary was. But no one acted on it at that time. It was just much of that area, actually, except for the car park, and I think one little kind of playground area outside of a school, most of the land, I showed you that kind of digital reproduction, there was a lot of land. I mean, it was a huge, huge area. And a lot of that land has been built over. There are office buildings, there are underground wires there. You can't dig all that up. You can't do that. So the only places they could dig, and that's why the university was kind of like, I don't know what we'll really find, because most of it is buried under all this stuff that's already been built upon. But indeed, so the only place they could dig was underneath this parking garage and this playground area. And luckily they hit pay dirt. They did get exactly the right spot. And in fact, at one point there's evidence, and this is, the thing with England and with Italy's the same way. Rome, layer upon layer upon, well, England actually more than Italy. The ancient Roman ruins are still there, invisible to see. In England, like London and other places, you've got the layer that is Roman occupation, then you've got the Anglo-Saxons, then you've got the medieval, then you've got the Victorian, and it goes up and up and up. So the ground gets bigger, higher and higher and higher. And when they were doing this excavation, one of the things they found was on top of where Richard was buried, at one point had been a Victorian outhouse. So they had to dismantle that. And that's why they're saying, it's really amazing that his skeleton was so well intact. I mean, it was like almost untouched. But they did discover, I didn't talk about it in the lecture, but they did discover his helmet had been torn from him. They could tell by defensive wounds, not defensive wounds, but wounds he had, that his helmet was cut off. He had several injuries to his face, some of which they think happened after he died. In fact, his body had several injuries that they think were post-death. And then two things that they know, one or both killed him, which was one, I think, through the eye or through the top of his brain, and one through the back of his skull. But they think his helmet was intentionally ripped off so that they could attack him that way. Yeah. Other
really interesting.
Yeah, one more recommendation if you enjoy getting your history from his big fat historical novels. One of the better ones about Richard III is Sharon Penman. Would you agree, Deb? The Sun and Splendor.
Yeah, I read that a very, very long time
A
ago.
long time
Yes,
ago. I don't know if
yeah,
it held
yeah,
up, but it
yeah.
captured me when I read it, as you know, years ago.
Yeah, I am sympathetic to Richard. I don't think anyone is all saintly, and I like to think no one is all evil, although there might be a few people floating around that are, but you know, I do honestly think he had a very compelling reason to get rid of those boys, but so too did others, you know. So I'm not of the school that, oh no, he was innocent. He was totally innocent. I think he was mistreated by history for sure. We know from that skeletal remains, we know that he was nothing like he was portrayed by Shakespeare. And as I say, what John Ross said, I mean, after reading that description, he was 2 years in his mother's womb. I'm like, okay, I don't care what else this guy has to say. I don't care if he was living with Richard, you know, I mean, this is ridiculous in and of itself.
So the DNA they confirmed through some cabinet maker in Leicester.
This was very interesting. No, he's a Canadian. He lives in London, Ontario. And the way this was really very fortuitous. So it was this guy living in London, Ontario. His mother had been approached in the 1980s because someone is doing a dig in Burgundy, and Richard's sister had married the Duke of Burgundy, and I think she married the Duke of Burgundy. She was living in Burgundy, and they found these 2 bodies in Burgundy, and they suspected that one of them may have been Richard's sister. And there was a professor over there and someone working on genealogy, and somehow they were able to connect through genealogy Richard's sister to this woman in Canada. So they contacted her, they took her DNA, turned out she was not a match. But what they concluded then was this was not Richard's sister because she wasn't a match, but they weren't sure. They're like, okay, either this was Richard's sister and our genealogy was wrong, or this is not Richard's sister. So when this happened, when they found Richard, somebody remembered this guy that did the genealogy with a woman in Canada. So they contacted her again. She was dead. She had died by then, but they got a hold of her son. And so her son came over and he said, yeah, he flew over and he said, you can take a swab of my, and that's how they discovered, yes, indeed, they were connected.
Wow.
So, and then he ended up making the cabinet, I'm sorry, the coffin. He made the coffin that Richard is buried in. He made the coffin. Yeah, very interesting. Just a fluke. If this first one hadn't happened, you know, how they would have come up with the DNA evidence, I don't know. But yeah, so it worked out.
Just a quick question, Mrs. Stephanie. Can you repeat the name of that book you were talking about, Betsy?
Yes, it's called The Sunne, SUNNE, Middle English spelling, in Splendor, and I think it's OUR, Splendor. And it's Sharon Penman, PENMAN.
And we can probably get the office to email it out.
Yes,
absolutely. Yeah, thanks. Yeah. I really don't have good control of my hand to write it down, but I'd be interested in that, especially to see if they have it at the library, because I'm fascinated by this kind of stuff.
It's a doorstop of a book, but it captured me. I was a much younger person, you know, and
I love historical work, you know, and so it's
historical novels.
Yes.
And Penman's hers kind of got overshadowed by Dorothy Tay. I mean, by Josephine Tay's. Like people kind of, they remember the Josephine Tay book, but not a lot of them. And she wrote some other really good historical.
Yes. Oh yeah. I think there's a trilogy that is the War of the Roses.
Yeah, the War of the Roses trilogy.
Yeah, I'd be interested in if you, Deb, if you ever do something on. I know you had mentioned at the beginning that the War of the Roses was too long to get into now, but you know, I'd be interested. I'd be signing up if I'm still alive.
I'm the one who browbeat her into doing Richard III. So
she did.
And it happened to be delayed or something, so I could actually. Well, it wasn't delayed for me, but I thought I had missed it, and I didn't miss it, so I got to listen in. And even though 3/4 of the time, just the last 10 minutes, I found the volume and I could hear you. I was constantly
Oh,
going
no.
to try to hear you.
Stephanie, all of these have been recorded. There's
Yeah.
one on Eleanor of Aquitaine, and there's
Oh, yeah.
one on Anne
Anne
Boleyn.
Boleyn and one
Yeah.
on the royal
And they're recorded
coronation.
on the LLH website. And if you have issues using your iPad, I'm sure somebody at the office can walk through it.
Yeah,
Because
all
Deb
of-
does good stuff. You don't
Yes,
want
she
to.
does. She does. I'm so grateful.
well,
Okay,
thank
I'll
you.
go back on mute.
Any
Okay.
other? You're welcome. Any other comments, questions?
No, but Deb, I have another assignment for you.
Oh, no. Hey, I've still got May, June, and no, wait a minute. I've got April, May, no, we are in April, May, June, July, and August. I still have a bunch. What's your
I
new
mean,
assignment?
wouldn't it be? It's a little bit. I think a little bit before your main area of interest, but Catherine Swinford and John of Gaunt.
Oh, yeah.
Because you had mentioned the
yeah.
Beauforts, and she is the beginning of that line, and that's a fascinating story.
They're
And for
all-
those of you again who want your history from novels, read Catherine by Anya Seton. Best
Gosh, that's an
historical
old one
novel.
too. That's a really
Yeah,
old one.
and again, it might not hold up, but wow.
Yeah, well,
was-
John of Gaunt, actually, when I was talking about Henry VII, and I said he had this
Right.
illegitimate blood on his mother's side, it was through John of Gaunt.
Right, exactly. And
yeah.
she was his, I think third wife, but most of her children were born before they were married,
Yeah,
I guess.
yeah, but then they were later legitimized, so
Right.
I don't, so that illegitimacy thing was,
Yeah.
on that side, it was a little shaky, but I think all of history is fascinating if you tell it the right way. I
Oh,
think
yeah.
I think it's a shame that the kids get bored with history, because if you just do nothing but throw dates and names at people,
Yeah,
it gets really stale really fast. But if you can relate it to people's motivations and their psychological stuff and what they're thinking and why they're acting the way they act, and then to me, it gets a lot more interesting. And I'm always interested in the psychology behind it. That's the thing that fascinates me about Richard. It's like, what was his motivation? If it was, what, but yeah, I always.
Hey, Deb, I got a suggestion to keep you going.
Yes.
I remember as a child, my mom, a traveling salesman, that tells you how long ago this was. She kind of got she ended up purchasing one time Encyclopedia Britannica.
Mhm.
Right. And of course, for a long time, we weren't allowed to use it or touch it or anything. It was but eventually we got to use it. And I can't remember what year it was or whatnot, but I was fascinated by, those books. And I remember opening up and finding this sort of like pictorial world history map. The background or the watermark was sort of like the whole world map, and it would have pullouts of all the different things that were happening at different times. And the time that you are specialized in, I would think I would love to, if you could somehow do something like that, where I could identify with, okay, this was going on here in Great Britain and all of its, countries that it was in charge of, but this was going on over in the Middle East, and this was going over in
Italy,
Asia, and that kind of stuff. And that just would be wonderful, but I think it would be a difficult task to take on, but that visual thing, it really stimulated my desire to see the world.
And it is very interesting to connect that timeline of what was happening, at those in various countries at the same time. Yeah.
Yeah. And lastly, I want to say, watching you, being able to see you so animated, that really, gives me a lot of inspiration, because I feel that way when I learn about history.
Okay.
And so thank you very
Oh,
much.
you're
I have
welcome.
to
You're
get
welcome.
off because I have to prepare for my big other two.
Okay, well,
We all
thank you
we've
for
kept
coming,
Deb way too
everybody.
long, but
But-
thank you again, Deb. I'm looking forward to the next one.
Well, the next one will
Me
be
too.
coming up in May. The next one is on the first two King Charleses. So,
Yes.
yeah, so see some of you then. Thanks so much for turning out.
Bye.
Thank you.
How do I do this? Wait.